Today we're talking about the Canon RF 35mm F1.8 Macro IS STM lens, specifically for video. We're going to talk about some pros, some cons, and who do I think this lens is for. Let's get into it. Well, my name is Tony. I'm a filmmaker, photographer in the St. Louis area. Today we're talking about the RF 35mm. I just picked this up. I'm excited. It's my first RF lens, and we're gonna talk about it specifically for video use. Maybe I'll do a review sometime in the future for photo, but today I wanna talk about specifically for video. Now we'll talk through the specs of this thing, we'll talk about some of the pros and cons, and then I'll get into who do I think should buy this lens and if it was the right purchase for me. Let's go through the specs. It's an RF mount, meaning that it can only be used on right now the EOS R, the EOS RP, and the EOS RA. That's really the only RF mount cameras available right now. Now I know that Red's coming out with one, and obviously Canon is going to. I'm excited about the future of RF mounts. I think that they're much smarter than the EF ones because they're 20 years newer, and it's the future of Canon, and I would say even some cinematography. I think that it's gonna be a big lens mount to invest in. For me though, right now, it kind of sucks because this lens only works on my Canon EOS R bodies. So like my C100 Mark II right there, 5D Mark IV, all of these cameras that are available to me, I can only use EF lenses. So that means that this is unavailable for any of the cameras besides my EOS R. 35mm focal length is a standard. I love using this. For weddings, I shoot on the 35, I shoot on the 85, and the 70-200, and that's basically all I shoot on all day long. So the 35mm lens is very important to me. I use lenses like the 1.4, which is not stabilized. I use the other EF 35mm F2.0 IS, which is stabilized. And I'm excited to see how this fits into my workflow specifically for weddings. The next spec to talk through is the F1.8. Now that is the aperture rating, which is fairly good. It's not quite as good as some of my other lenses, the 1.2s, 1.4s, but 1.8 is still very capable with low light, and it will be able to get you some fairly good depth of field, even with a wide angle like 35mm. The next thing is macro. Macro is really huge for me. I love having macro lenses, not because I like to take pictures of really tiny things, but I love the fact that macro lenses have no minimum focusing distance, or at least up to the point where I would need them. So a lot of times with my 85 1.4, when I'm shooting a wedding and I'm getting really close on the ring, I just did a proposal like this week, and I was trying to push in with 85, and I keep hitting that focal, that minimum focusing distance, and it's annoying. Now with a macro lens, the 100mm, the 35mm f1.8 now, I can push in and keep pushing in and never hit that minimum focusing distance. It's a big deal for me. The next thing to talk through is the image stabilization. Yes, this lens has it, which makes it ideal for video. All of my lenses, or as many as I can, I love to have image stabilization on because it helps you with video. It makes everything more smooth. Even when I'm shooting on the Ronin, I still keep the IS on because if it's not needed, the lens will actually turn itself off and I don't have to worry about that image stabilization messing up my shot. Now that used to be a thing in the past. Maybe if you have a really old version of IS, that's a problem, but any new lens, just leave your IS on all the time. Put a piece of black tape over it so that it doesn't get bumped. Do it. Pro tip. All right, next spec is the STM, which stands for stepping motors and is specifically regarding the motors inside the lens for focusing. Now there's two basic types. There's lots of variations, but there's the STM lenses and there's USM lenses. Like a lot of the L glass are USM, so it's technically better. Now that's not necessarily true. The advantage that STM lenses have is that the focusing is much smoother and fluid. With STM, it's very snappy, which is really good for photos, but not necessarily for video. I've noticed with this, if you tap on the screen, it slowly pulls focus, making it very appealing for video. So now that we've talked through the specs of this lens, let's talk about some of the pros that I've seen regarding this one over maybe some of the other ones that I've used in the past. Obviously, the big thing is the IS and the macro. I think that those are very, very, very good features to stuff into a budget lens. I mean, this is by far the cheapest RF mount glass that you can have right now, and it's got some great features. I love the fact that they were able to put macro on here and image stabilization. That's a big selling point for me. Another really big pro that I see is the size of this thing compared to, say the 35mm F1.4. It's quite a bit bigger and longer. It's fairly light, which makes having a really small package in my bag ready to go. Now, you don't have to have the adapter, which is also a very nice feature, which is kind of, it makes the camera even smaller. So now what I'm basically doing is I just never put a lens cap on my camera. I just put this lens on there and boom, I'm good to go. I've always got a lens on my camera ready to go, and it's such a small package without that adapter, it fits in my bag perfectly. Speaking of that RF mount, I've noticed that the autofocus is insanely fast compared to my EF glass. Now, I never thought that the EF autofocus was slow, but I feel like it's almost like opening up the camera's potential with this new RF glass. This is my first one that I've got. I'm excited to have some RF glass in my kit, but I've noticed there is a significant jump in performance with the autofocus. Also, along those same lines, I've noticed that the images are really, really crisp on this. Now, they were on my other ones too. I just feel like this is a little bit next level, and I'm certain that it's because that mount is native. Canon did a great job incorporating the EF glass and being able to transition that system over, but I'm excited. Then this gives me a little bit more hope for purchasing some RF glass in the future. I'm excited to see what the 70-200 does, because if a 400 budget lens performs like this, I can't wait to see what some of those L series glasses do. All right, so now that we've talked through some of the pros, let's talk about some of the cons specifically for me. The first one I want to mention is the kind of goofy filter size. 52mm filter is a little strange for me because most of my other ones are either 67, 77, or 58. And so now I've got yet another step-up ring that I have to carry with me. Or I have to buy another ND filter for this. Just a little bit of a con for me. I know some people have 52mm lenses, but for me, this is my first one, and now I've got 52, 58, 67, and 77 that I now have to think through while I'm adapting things. I wish that it would have been like a 67. I know that that's a really small camera lens for that, but 67 and 77 are my main two ones. The 35mm F2.8 IS is 67, and the 100mm macro is 67, and so there's a lot of my lenses that have that 67mm filter size, so I've only got to have a 67 and a 77 filter. So now I'm just going to stick a step-up ring on here, which will get me by, but for me, that's a disadvantage. Another one is I have noticed that the adapter is now annoying. I've never had this problem before because the adapter was essentially built into the camera. Now, whenever I pull off this lens and I try and stick my 70-200 on there, there's no adapter. And so I have to figure out what I did with my adapter. I've almost forgot it twice, making the camera almost useless, besides a 35mm, but fortunately I have not forgotten the adapter. I'm trying to figure out how does this adapter work into my workflow. It is kind of annoying. So I've got a choice to either buy all RF glass and not worry about the adapter, or, you know, just kind of stick with EF glass, which is what I've done in the past. Now I just have another component that I have to think through my workflow. All right, so one more disadvantage that I have noticed with this, when I am throwing this, say on my Ronin, it's a really light setup, which for most people is a great thing, but I don't mind the heftiness of a camera because that adds in a little bit more stabilization. And I've noticed when I'm on the Ronin and I'm doing some really fast things that there's almost some wobble in there because it's so light. I've noticed this when I've used the A7S II as well. It's just a really light setup. So there's a couple things that I can do to kind of help that, and one of which is I purchased the new Rode NTG VideoNTG, whatever it is. I'm adding a little bit heavier components within the system to kind of make up for some of the lightweight stabilization that I'm seeing. So not a huge disadvantage, and honestly, who complains about having a camera too light? Well, I guess I do. All right, so who do I think that this lens is for? Good question. I think that this is a perfect lens for somebody who just bought the EOS R and doesn't have any other lenses. Say they just switched from Sony, say they're just getting into real cameras. This is a great lens. If you only have one lens, this is not a bad one to have, and it's fairly cheap. You can get it for less than 500 bucks for most of the time, and you've got yourself a 35mm camera, which is fairly standard for photo and video. It's got image stabilization, so you don't have to buy a bunch of extra things. It's got macro. You can really experiment and have fun with this if this is the only lens that you have. The other person that I think should buy this is if you want a 35mm prime. You have no choice other than this right now. You could get the 28-70, it's not a prime. You could get the 24-70, it's not a prime. You could get the 24-105, it's not a prime. This is the only prime 35 in the lineup right now. And I know that will change and they'll come out with an L series one, but right now, if you want all RF glass, this is your 35mm. All right, wrapping up this review. For me, I'm excited to have this in my workflow. Like I said, it's just kind of my new lens cap for my EOS R. I'm gonna have it in my everyday backpack, and I wasn't able to really have a lens in it before because the way that it packed, it just was too big to have a lens on there. So with this tiny thing without the adapter, it's really tiny, and I can get what I need to until I can put a telephoto on or whatever it is. So I think it's a great purchase. I think if you're just getting into the EOS R system, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's definitely the cheapest lens. The next one would be the 24-105, which is a great lens, but that's not nearly as good with low light. So I would love to hear your feedback. What have you seen? Do you have this lens? Have you noticed that it's sharp? Have you had any trouble with it? So far, this has been a perfect purchase to complement the EOS R, and I'm excited to see the video that I can make with it. So with that being said, we're gonna wrap this video up with some sample footage that I shot making coffee. I tried to mix in some handheld, I tried to mix in some macro, and just kind of give you a glimpse of what is possible with this lens. All right, we'll see you next week. Have a good one.